Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to this week's edition of the Virtual Center for the study of the U.S. Constitution and civic responsibility. It is a pleasure to be with you today as we enter into March. Today's the third day of March, and I don't believe that the calendar and the seasons are in sync this year. We are in for one of our colder evenings of the colder nights of the year. We are just on the tail end of a storm that has been pounding us most of the day and a good portion of last night. And I was telling Bob before we went on the air, I just got in shoveling. We've got 5 or 6 inches of a snow ice mix in our driveway. So I spent about the last 40 minutes out there trying to shovel, and I got about 3/4 of the driveway done. And you'd be hard to put to prove to me that it's the third day of March if I didn't know it was the third day of March. But anyway, I'm watching on the weather forecasts, the Weather Channel and others, that this new phenomenon that we've discovered this winter called the polar vortex is making another visit to the 48, as it were, and we're looking for record lows this evening, all the way down to the Mexican border. So this is somewhat unique, and it's really interesting. I was listening to one of the weather gurus today, one of the meteorologists, and he was making the point that the United States is pretty well situated to be in the crosshairs of some pretty extreme weather for the foreseeable future, and that there's really no part of the United States that's exempt from this. I mean, from the floods and the droughts of California to the extreme cold, to the snow, to the floods, to the winds. It's really interesting because throughout its history, the United States has always been able to brag about the fact that we seem to be in the perfect location on the face of this planet. We have, we are among the richest areas in the world in natural resources. We seem to have, over the generations, have had a variety of weather options, where if people wanted warm weather, they could get it. If people wanted changes of seasons, they could get it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, all of a sudden, with some of the changes that are happening in climate, it seems like we may end up being in the worst place on the face of the planet rather than in the best place. But anyway, that's my weather forecast for the day. I do welcome you to this week's programs. This is the first of 3 programs that we'll be doing this week. I do welcome you to the Virtual Center. I'm going to follow the housekeeping chores, which involves phone numbers and email addresses and that kind of thing, with kind of an update on where I've been in the last several days and what I've been doing. And I think you'll find out very clearly today, because I'm going to introduce a number of the things that I've been working on here at the Virtual Center today, and hope and solicit as much as I can the input of you, the listeners and the participants in the Virtual Center, because I really need your input in order to make sure that I'm on track. But before we get there, let me take care of the normal housekeeping business. We do have a phone number, and we do invite you to participate actively in our program by calling in and making your positions and ideas heard on a number of issues of the day, issues that we'll be talking about here at the Virtual Center. The phone number is area code 304-658-3333. That's 304-658-3333. If you'd like to communicate directly with me, I invite you to do that, and a number of you have. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien, BRIEN 906@gmail.com. Last time we were together, which was last Wednesday, I was going to say it was in February when we were having winter, but now it's March and we're still having winter. So, but last Wednesday, when last we were together, I had introduced some issues related to the development of copy for a website that we'll be creating here at the Virtual Center. And as I mentioned last time, I've been spending an awful lot of time on the copy for this website. I have a couple of good friends that are working with me and are willing to transpose the copy that I put together into the kind of website that they believe and hopefully and I have to believe will do justice to the program and to the mission of the Virtual Center. And so basically what they've asked me for is copy. More specifically, of course, what they really want is a business plan. And what I'm giving them is everything I've got, and I'm saying, you know, somewhere in the midst of this might be the makings of a business plan, but I'm going to kind of leave it up to you, the experts, to discover and make those kinds of connections. But in the process, what this assignment has prompted from me is some fairly intensive writing and reflection on my part on not only on what I would like to see the Virtual Center be and become, because we've talked about that off and on before. We've been on now that we're in March, I would say that we're probably in our 10th or 11th month. I believe we may have begun in April, no later than May of last year. So we're in our 10th month, which means that on and off over that time, we've fumbled around more than once about the nature of the center and the vision for the center and the idea of a mission and all the rest of it. So I don't think any of this is new. But what I've been trying to do is get down on paper to my own satisfaction why I believe the Virtual Center is not only worthwhile but necessary. And increasingly, while the focus obviously is on the Constitution and issues related to and surrounding the Constitution, the fact of the matter is it's almost inevitable that we continue to come back to the issue of education. Specifically, what people know and don't know, understand and don't understand, think they know but really don't, about the Constitution itself, about the process which produced it, about the Supreme Court decisions which have expounded and elaborated upon it, and indeed, in some cases, shifted emphasis in I think, important ways. And all of this is kind of coming together in what I hope is a fairly literate, make sense kind of effort to really explain the center, explain what I would like to see happen with the center, and I believe, and I firmly believe this, and more important, to define and lay out very clearly, not for my own purposes, but for other people's purposes who would be using the website, on what the purposes of the center are and why I believe it is so incredibly important. The more we have talked about and speculated about education in our society, the more convinced that I have become that the confusions, misunderstandings, half-truths, outright lies, all of those things associated with what people know or think they know about the nature of the political system under which we live, the republic that the founders gave us, if we can keep it, according to the comments of Benjamin Franklin in 1787. I think all of this is very, very relevant. I think we are entering into a phase in this 21st century of development and education and technological advancement in this world, which in many cases is creating what I would call a totally new ballgame for the nation, for the citizens of the nation, for the political structure that governs that nation, and for the elected officials who man that nation and seek to lead it into the midst of the 21st century. And one of the things that I feel like we have stumbled upon, I'm not sure stumbled is the appropriate word, but there's absolutely no question that there it is and we keep bumping into it, is an education system, and I'm not just talking about K through 12, nor am I just talking about higher education. I'm talking about a combination of the two. We are dealing with an education system that, for whatever reason, is really not adequate to deal with some of the challenges that we face as a nation and that our political system faces as a republic that derives its power from the consent of the governed. A republic that depends for its very existence and strength on input from what I call an educated citizenry. I believe that from that perspective, we may be dealing with an education system that needs overhaul and repair, at least when one focuses on the specifics of civic education, the role of citizens in this republic. I am very aware, as you are, because we've talked about this off and on numerous times, I'm very aware about the obvious contradictions that seem to exist amongst the founders over the ideals of the republic and the role of citizens in it on the one hand, and the structure and delivery associated with the educational system on the other. Although one might get into a little bit of controversy trying to pin too much about the educational system directly on the founders, the fact of the matter is that the founders, and I'm thinking specifically of Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Rush, two of the documents that we've looked at here at the Virtual Center in some detail, these two, perhaps as much or more than any others, have really played an instrumental role in the nature of education in America. And I believe in the process we have revealed a gargantuan contradiction between the role envisioned for the for citizens by the founders and the nature of the education system, which in theory at least is supposed to make that role, that participation of citizens possible and meaningful. And consequently, we are confronted with, I believe, for lack of a better term, what some people refer to as a conundrum, a contradiction that needs to be addressed and needs to be resolved. How is it that such intelligent, well-read, worldly people as the founders could, on the one hand, advocate a substantive responsible role for citizens in keeping the republic on track by keeping elected officials honest and keeping the public interest in the forefront of what public officials spend most of their time doing. And at the same time, champion and advocate and help define an educational system that realistically has almost no chance of preparing the vast majority of citizens for the kind of role that the framers have outlined as being critical to the success and the future of this republic. These are not stupid people. On the contrary, Jefferson himself referred to those attending the Constitutional Convention as an assembly of demigods. History has called these people, these founders of ours, probably the most astounding collection of brilliant minds in one place at one time in the history of the world. The bulk of them, the bulk of those who attended the Constitutional Convention, as well as the convention, the Continental Congresses, which ultimately declared independence for the 13 colonies in 1776. Many of them were college educated. Many of them were ministers or attorneys. Most of them were very, very prominent in their states, in their colonies. They were very successful businessmen. A number of them were obviously slave owners. We know that. These are not a random collection of people. These individuals make up the best that America had to offer during this period of late 18th century American history. We know what they did with the Declaration, with the Constitution, with the structure of government they created, they fashioned at Philadelphia in 1787. We know the brilliance of some of the founding fathers: Madison, John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, to name three, the authors of the so-called Federalist Papers. We also know, in some of the more prominent anti-Federalist papers, that they were authored by some of the brightest individuals in America as well. The Richard Henry Lees and the Patrick Henrys, and the one I'm going to mention is in Maryland, and he's not that well known, but Luther Martin, who was an attorney, a Baltimore attorney, and was considered one of the brightest, most insightful attendees at the Constitutional Convention, even though he ended up as an opponent of the Constitution and walked out of the convention in the middle. He led the fight in Maryland against ratification of the Constitution. He wrote and spoke extensively in opposition to the Constitution drafted in Philadelphia. He felt that it was a mistake for America. It was a definite mistake for the state of Maryland. And his analysis of many of the more poignant phrases within the Constitution, and his analysis of the different positions during debates at the Constitutional Convention is second to none, really. In fact, there's absolutely no question that most of the Federalist attention to Luther Martin was spent trying to demean him as an alcoholic, which he was, but trying to demean his alcoholism in order to weaken, if not destroy, his credibility. because he was so bright and so insightful, and his comments were so on target and so difficult to refute that, to be very honest with you, Federalists were left with little alternative except to try to challenge his credibility. The assumption being, if we could so besmirch his character that people wouldn't take him seriously, then effectively maybe they won't. And that is essentially the role that Luther Martin plays in the history of the origins of this nation during the founding period. When the Constitutional Convention was over, Luther Martin collected a lot of his papers and his speeches and his analysis of different aspects of the Constitution into a series of papers which he published in a publication called Genuine Information. And Genuine Information is one of the most brilliant collections of constitutional analysis ever written in American society. I'm not going to make judgment calls and say that in some ways it was as brilliant, if not more brilliant, than some of the Federalist Papers, but there's absolutely no question that in a number of cases it was. I don't think anyone would advocate or argue for the brilliance and insightfulness necessarily of the papers that John Jay wrote. He didn't write that many of the Federalist Papers. He wrote, I believe, 10, maybe even less than 10. And most of his focused on foreign policy. On the other hand, there's no question that some of Madison's papers and Hamilton's papers on the court, on the Supreme Court, are brilliant. But so also Luther Martin's Genuine Information is brilliant as well. The point I'm trying to make is I don't want to get off on a tangent here necessarily, but the point I'm trying to make is these were brilliant people, whether they were for the Constitution or whether they were against the Constitution. James Wilson of Pennsylvania, for example, an ardent Federalist. Unfortunately, at the convention, and of course at the Continental Congresses that ultimately ratified the Declaration, approved the Declaration of Independence, James Wilson was considered to be in the shadow always of John Dickinson and of Rutledge, John Rutledge of South Carolina. Those two also were absolutely brilliant legalists and jurists. But the fact of the matter is James Wilson has left us with some brilliant constitutional analysis of positions on a number of issues. The point of all of this is that these were bright people. They were insightful people. They were jurists. They were judges. They were attorneys. They were successful businessmen. They were well-educated people. They were well-read. Most of them were quite familiar with the ancients. They had read Plato and Aristotle and Cicero and Seneca and and Catullus and all of these. They knew what they were talking about when they were conceptualizing a political system like the Constitution of the United States. They knew what they were talking about. So the question remains, how could brilliant people like this be so blatantly contradictory when it came down to the nature of the education system that many of them advocated? It is nothing but blatant kindness to suggest that, well, maybe they didn't recognize the contradiction. Maybe they really believed in the principles and the theories of Republican government, a government of the people, a government driven by participation of the people, and maybe they were so committed to it that they didn't see the contradictions between the people's role as citizens and the educational role they played as students in education in the schools. I think to argue that stretches credibility beyond its limits. Because to argue that seems to deny the brilliance of these people, of these men. Consequently, one has to conclude that what we see as contradictions in the education system, in the ability of the education system to produce what they claimed they wanted, which was an educated citizenry, one must conclude that they were aware of the contradiction and they chose, for whatever reason, to paper it over, to pretend it wasn't there, to deny it, even though they recognized it. We spent quite a bit of time on Jefferson's bill proposed for Virginia in the 1770s, entitled A Bill for the General Diffusion of Knowledge. We spent quite a bit of time on that. Let me share with you, if you will permit me, a couple of examples of the dramatic nature of the contradiction that I'm addressing here. I'm going through my papers here as quickly as I can. And most of us know that in addition to this general bill for the general diffusion of knowledge, which was Jefferson's plan for universal education for all children, rich and poor alike, and the mandatory 3 years that he advocated, Jefferson is also responsible for the creation of the University of Virginia in Charlottesville. And it seems to be beyond belief that the same person could be behind both educational plans. I'm not going to go back into the general diffusion of knowledge bill because we looked at that in some detail. But let me look at just a couple of statements, a couple of things that Jefferson wrote about the University of Virginia. In 1802, while he was president, Jefferson wrote his good friend Joseph Priestley. And in that letter, he talked about the university that he had in mind for Virginia. He said, and I quote, "We wish to establish in the upper country of Virginia, and more centrally for the state, a university on a plan so broad and liberal and modern as to be worth patronizing with the public support, and be a temptation to the youth of other states to come and drink of the cup of knowledge and fraternize with us." Jefferson is envisioning the University of Virginia to be an institution that is so good, so academically solid, that youngsters from other states and well-placed parents from other states will want to see their children come to Virginia in order to be able to take advantage of attendance at this premier institution, where they could, according to Jefferson, come and drink of the cup of knowledge. In 1820, after he left the presidency, while the University of Virginia was emerging, he wrote to a friend, William Roscoe, in 1820, and talked a little bit about the University of Virginia. He said, "This institution will be based on the illimitable freedom of the human mind. For here we are not afraid to follow truth wherever it may lead, nor to tolerate any error so long as reason is left free to combat it." Jefferson is talking about an institution that puts the focus on the development and the freedom of the human mind and the pursuit of truth, and the freedom to pursue truth wherever it may lead, and to make certain that reason is left free to fix any mistakes that might be made in the process. In 1826, by this time Jefferson's becoming an old man, as you know, he writes to John Emmett and says the following: "We do not expect our schools to turn out their alumni already enthroned on the pinnacles of their respective sciences, but only so far advanced in each as to be able to pursue them by themselves, and to become Newtons and Laplaces by energies and perseverances to be continued through life." What Jefferson is talking about here is lifelong learning, is an education at the University of Virginia that is so good that students who go there will become learners for the rest of their lives. And they will be so well educated in the sciences, whatever they might be, that the university will produce its own versions of Newtons and Laplaces. And that these people will be so well educated as to be able to pursue education by themselves after they leave. Can I quote what I wrote in response to that? "No mention here of securing society's safety, ensuring future order, fitting students for more peaceable and uniform government, creating little Republican machines. None of that. The subject here was quality of education, the kind that prompted Jefferson to envision an endless flow of America's best and brightest to his new university near Monticello. Like Plato's formula for educating guardians in his republic." Quote from Plato: "Men who are wisest about affairs of state, and by whom the state is to be administered." Jefferson set about to dedicate his university to educating the future leaders of America's republic. What we have here is a major contradiction in kind and level of education, depending I've got to be blunt, depending on who you are, depending on where you come from, and consequently, depending on where you will end up after you are educated. Your past determines your future, and it dictates the kind of education that you are capable of experiencing, that you are capable of benefiting from. That's just the most obvious example of the extent to which, when it comes to education, the founders seem to be talking out of both sides of their mouth at the same time. It's not just Jefferson. Let me give you a few examples of some of the other founders. To the end of his life, George Washington supported the creation of what he called a national university for the express purpose of training the nation's leaders for governing in a republic. To that end, Washington willed 50 shares of his stock in the Potomac Company toward that project, the establishment of a national university. Washington wrote that besides nurturing their patriotism, students at his national university would, and this is a quote, would receive the polish of erudition in the arts, sciences, and belles lettres. Beautiful letters. Literature. The humanities. Besides nurturing their patriotism, this national university that Washington advocated would educate students so that they would receive the polish of erudition in the arts, sciences, and the finest in literature that the world has to offer. John Adams. John Adams wrote to his son John Quincy, and in one letter made reference to the fact that there are two kinds of education. One should teach us how to make a living, and the other one, how to live. When in 1786 Benjamin Rush was writing his mode of education proper in a republic for the masses, if you recall, his mode of operation being the use of the Christian Bible in order to teach people to read and to bring truth to the people. At that very same time, in 1786, John Adams was enrolling his son John Quincy in Harvard. Obviously, in John Adams's mind, how to live won out over how to find a job. Benjamin Franklin, who for a long time advocated a more practical, less classical education than the other founders advocated, was responsible for the creation of what was called the College of Philadelphia, which became the University of Pennsylvania, which is one of the finest Ivy League institutions in the United States today. Franklin's purpose? To train those who would enter the world of finance and international commerce. Practical knowledge for the world of international trade, commerce, and finance. The leaders in the world of business. Franklin was instrumental in setting up a university to meet their needs. When Benjamin Rush proposed that the nation's universities ought to drop the study of classical languages and replace them with more modern languages, like French and German, for example, John Adams went ballistic. One of the most poignant letters that anybody ever wrote, John Adams sent to Benjamin Rush when he proposed to drop the study of Latin and Greek for more modern languages. John Adams wrote to Benjamin Rush, "I do most cordially hate you for writing against Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. I will never forgive you until you repent, until you retract and reform. No, never." Washington and Hamilton together were instrumental in the creation of West Point on the Hudson. America, as we know in its early years, was hell-bent against the idea of a standing army. And of course you can understand why, given the British occupation of Boston and the Boston Massacre and all of that from our history. Washington and Hamilton were determined to create an institution of higher learning that would educate those who would lead an army should America ever need one. Hamilton argued that while America was determined to avoid the existence of a standing army, to substitute the elements of an army for the thing itself, Hamilton said, was quite appropriate. And then, of course, there's Jefferson. Washington, Hamilton, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Rush, actively involved in the development and creation of some of the finest universities in the Western world. At the same time, are advocating education proper for citizens in a republic. Which emphasize things like laying the foundations of future order, making society safe, fitting students for more peaceable and uniform government, in Russia's case, creating little republican machines. You have to be blind not to see that the founders were advocating two different, totally separate systems of education. One for the nation's leaders, a second one for the nation's followers. They clearly defined a role for citizens in a republic which rendered the vast majority of the people in that republic totally dependent upon their leaders. Consequently, the education system they advocated had to be one which advocated conformity, regimentation, obedience, responsibility, rote memorization of information. All of it under cover of the fact that the information children were receiving in school was truth. Let's go back for a moment to the statement of James Madison about knowledge and learning. And power. This is, you remember, the statement or quotation that opens or will open this website of the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. James Madison wrote in 1822, "A popular government without popular information or the means of acquiring it is but a prologue to a farce and or a tragedy, or perhaps both. Knowledge will forever govern ignorance, and a people who mean to be their own governors must arm themselves with the power which knowledge gives." Madison, in this statement, in this quote, distinguishes between knowledge and information. He points out that knowledge comes from people's ability to interact with information. The information is not the knowledge. What people learn from engaging the information is knowledge. And what Madison is saying here is that in order for education to lead to knowledge, students must be encouraged to engage that information, to ask questions about it, to seek its origins, to be aware of its implications, to seek out its intent, to be very, very precise on who is responsible for generating this information, what their agenda might be, what their ultimate goals are, what they want the people who receive this information to do with it. Is their goal to persuade people to a particular point of view? Is it merely to bring new information to people that didn't have that information before? Or is there some sort of political agenda associated with this particular information? All of that, to Madison, must be there in order to convert information into knowledge. And once you have knowledge, you have power. But if the education that you receive is nothing but information, if it's just content-based, if it's, one person made this statement one time, I can't remember who said this, but it's an absolutely beautiful statement. When asked about history, they said, history is just one damn thing after the other. If that's what history is to you as a student, if your exposure to history is just one damn thing after the other, one piece of information piled upon another piece of information, piled upon yet another piece of information, with every anticipation that this endless stream of education will never of information will never stop, If all you get is information and all you are asked to do is memorize it and regurgitate it, reproduce it on standardized tests, recognize it on competing columns in a matching test, recognize keywords and phrases for insertion into a fill-in-the-blank test, or respond to truths and falses, if that's the extent of your education, then you never experience learning. You never experience the process of engaging the information presented to you. On the contrary, you are operating on the assumption, and those that are giving you the information, your teachers, the textbook, or whatever, are helping to perpetrate the myth that the information you are being given is education. Consequently, the performance that you were able to deliver on a test, on standardized tests, is a measure of how well you recall or recognize pieces of information. Nowhere is there any indication at all that you understand the the information, you know where it came from, you know who's responsible for it, you know what the agenda is of the people who are responsible for it, you are aware of the tone of the information, you are aware of the intent of the information, you know exactly why the information is being presented to you, what the person who is responsible for it wants from you. Do they want you to believe? Do they want you to question? Do they want you to support? Do they want you to contribute? Do they want you to demonstrate? Do they want you to be outraged? In other words, what's going on here? And until you ask those questions and really understand the information presented to you, you have never really engaged it. And if you have never really engaged it, then you really have never been exposed to knowledge. You've never created any knowledge. Everything you know and everything you've ever been exposed to comes from somebody else. And if they are able to convince you that the information they are giving you is truth, then you have no option but to believe. Is that the role defined for the masses of citizens in a republic in the eyes of the founders? The same founders who were instrumental in creating some of the finest, most challenging, high-powered universities on the face of the earth. Jefferson saw the University of Virginia as a meaningful academic alternative to Virginia's only other college at the time, which was William and Mary. Jefferson was quite concerned about the religious overtones of the College of William and Mary because it was so heavily Anglican, Church of England. And its curriculum was riddled with elements of Scripture. And Jefferson felt that a much more knowledge-based scientific education was necessary for the leaders in this republic. Since this republic was not about one particular religion, this nation was comprised of a variety of different religions and ethnic groups and nationalities. And so government of all of these required an approach to education which Jefferson believed had to be quite different than what people were getting at William and Mary. So consequently, we are confronted with what is absolutely a contradiction that one cannot ignore or avoid or dismiss. Were the founders talking out of both sides of their mouth at the same time? Were the founders hypocrites? Did they say one thing and mean something totally different? Were the founders politicians who were more than willing to say whatever was popular to say, depending on who happened to be in the audience at the particular time? In other words, were they masters at telling people what they wanted to hear, not what they believed people needed to hear? Were they, in effect, seekers of people's favor? It seems to me all of these issues are relevant and critical. And all of them directly affect not only the quality of education in America, but the approach to the founding and the approach to constitutionalism that we take here at the Virtual Center. I go back to last week's programming for a moment, when I was able to share with you what I see as a mission statement for the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. This is what I believe this operation ought to be about. I'm reading here. To empower citizens via the Internet to rectify generations of civic education deficiencies by engaging the sources to convert information into knowledge, content into understanding, analytical skills into the means to lifelong learning. Translation: I see the Virtual Center as being in the forefront of serious efforts to rectify the contradictions that exist in American education. More specifically than that, I see the Virtual Center as the means, a mechanism for exposing the community at large, citizens, all citizens, not just ones who can pass a standardized test, not just citizens who qualify based on reading scores or math scores or anything else. All citizens who live and work in this society, and consequently one would expect will vote in this society, will help make decisions and elect our leaders. I see the Virtual Center as a mechanism for giving them an opportunity to experience the same kind of education that has been reserved only to the few for generations untold, for centuries untold. I see the Virtual Center as being in the forefront of educational reform in America. by giving all citizens the opportunity to really know, to really understand, to really appreciate, to be able to really think about what this nation is all about, what it ought to be all about, and what their roles as citizens in this republic ought to be all about. The history of the world, going all the way back to Plato, is based on the assumption that only the few can handle this kind of education. It seems to me that the international challenges that America faces in the 21st century require something completely different than we've been willing to do up until now. And that is, namely, look at our education system, whether it's college or whether it's K through 12. Look at our schools as being there to educate all citizens, not just the few, not just those who can pass muster, not just those who qualify, not just those who can pay, but all citizens. About their country, about its role in the world, about its mission, and its commitments. I see a direct link between the mission of the Virtual Center and the real concept of American exceptionalism. Because I believe, as I've said before, that what makes America an exceptional nation is not what it's done or where it is, but what it might do and where it might go. And for generations, we've believed that access to education is the way to get there. The Virtual Center will undertake that kind of education with that outcome as its objective. I think this is incredibly exciting. I think it's unbelievably challenging. Most important, we need you in order to make this successful. It's all about you. It's not about me. It's all about us together. I ask you to think about it, reflect upon it. If you are so inclined to email me about it, pick up the phone and call us and talk about it. But by all means, let's get some of these issues on the table, and let's talk about them as we've never done before. We've gone by the top of the hour. We're a few minutes after the 5 p.m. hour in the East. Let's pause and take a 5-minute break. We'll come right back, and we'll pursue this theme here at the Virtual Center for the study of the U.S. Constitution and civic responsibility. I think one of the things that's become very clear today is that we're kind of giving meaning to the idea of civic responsibility, why that tag is at the end of the Virtual Center, because I think it's critical. It's a key piece of the whole puzzle. So let's pause. This is Bill O'Brien. We'll be right back. Please stay with us. Bob, thank you very much, and welcome everyone back to the second hour of the Virtual Center. And without ado, before we even give phone numbers and everything, let's welcome Dr. John. Hi, John.
Hello, Dr. Bill. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Oh, very good, sir. I've been enjoying listening to you as well as last week. I've been meaning to write, but I figured I could maybe call.
Well, I appreciate it. I'm having a little bit of trouble with the sound here. I don't know. Must be the set of earphones I have or something. I'm picking up a lot of muffled sound, but I'll do the best I can, John. Hello? I think we may have lost John.
I think we did, Dr. Bill, but I bet he'll try back.
Okay. Well, anyway, let me do the housekeeping work. Thank you, Bob. Let me do the housekeeping work by giving you phone numbers and email addresses and all the rest of it. We do invite you to participate in the program. That's obviously what all of this is about. The phone number is area code 304-658-3333. That's 304-658-3333. My email address, if you'd like to communicate with me directly on any of this material. In fact, one person did, and I'll share that with you in a moment. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien, IEN 906, all one word, at gmail.com. Did receive an email over the weekend from one of our listeners about higher education. It was specifically referenced to an article which suggested that rather than colleges and universities ameliorating class differences in American society, the general gist of this piece was that our institutions of higher education might actually be contributing to a sense of elitism in America. And of course, part of that is because of the incredible cost shifting that's taken place in higher education. It wasn't all that long ago, and I'm talking 8-10 years, that individual students were paying approximately 1/3, maybe a little bit more, 1/3 of their own education. And 2/3 of their education, at public institutions at least, was being subsidized by taxpayers, by the nation at large. And the whole reason for this, the rationale was quite clear. The general impression from time immemorial was that an educated population is a key contributing factor to the welfare of the nation, to the public interest. And so consequently, all of us had a stake, had a vested interest in an educated citizenry. So therefore, we had to be more than willing to put our treasure, our money, where our mouth was, and help our young people pursue higher education to the best of their ability, to fulfill their potential, whatever that might be. We have undergone in recent years a change. I think it's a monumental change. And this article that the listener sent really sparked consideration and reflection upon this, but I really think it's important, very important. The change that we have undergone in recent years is that for budgetary reasons, states have begun to pull back on the amount of money that they are willing to allocate to higher education. And consequently, the burden of cost has been shifted from taxpayers to the individual student, to the point that students are carrying the bulk of the responsibility for their own education, whereas that did not used to be. Consequently, education is once again becoming the prize of the elite. It's becoming something that everybody can't afford. The debt is too large, and in the eyes of many people, the payoff is not worth it. The kind of jobs that are available for most people are not worthy of the degree of debt that higher education incurs, forces people to incur. All of this, it seems to me, speaks to an even more fundamental shift over the last 8 to 10 years. Whereas education used to be seen as a public good, education is now seen as a personal asset, a personal good. And all of this is consistent with the increasing emphasis in today's world on the idea that education is necessary to get a good job. For years, we've been convinced of that. We've been beaten over the heads with that. We've been asked to focus on the pursuit of careers as the major rationale for going to college. And the conclusion is that once the population at large became convinced that education was the ticket to individual success, then it stood to reason. The logical conclusion is, if the individuals are the ones that are going to get most of the success out of this, then why the hell shouldn't they pay for it? And so consequently, the public interest being served by large portion of the population attending college has pretty much fallen by the wayside.
Hey, Dr. Bill?
Yes, Bob.
We have John back on the line.
Okay, thank you.
All right, stand by.
Hey, John.
Hi, Dr. Bill. I'm going to try the handset, so maybe that's a little more effective there.
Oh, this is great. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, listen, like I said, this is fascinating for me, and I see a really strong connection between your discussion of what Google is looking for and how that relates to education from last week, and this discussion you started today. And my feeling on hearing this is actually, honestly, a little bit of fear. My feeling is that when we're thinking about how are we best serving, the nation as a whole and students as individual learners, and are we serving them better by pushing critical thinking, pushing the kind of things the Common Core is? I say absolutely yes. But what about the demand side of this skill set? Are we going to unleash people onto an economy that not only doesn't require skills like that, but in some cases is actively hostile to skills like that? And then how are we serving students if that's the case?
That's a great point. These are controversial skills. There's absolutely no question. And there is an element of hostility to them. And part of the reason, John, I think, and by all means, feel free to react to this however you will. Yeah. But I think that society has traditionally indicated that it's afraid of these skills. I think society has taken solace in being fairly confident that we knew what our students were going to come out of school believing. And I think the danger of these skills is that they take away that certainty. Because once you encourage students to think and once you show them how to think, you really surrender the right to dictate what they think. And I think it's, there's going to be serious hostility and fear of that. I really believe that. I think you're right on, John.
Well, yeah, and it's the first thing I thought, hearing that quote from Washington, that wonderful quote from Washington, the arts and sciences and the belles lettres. What happens when we send students that we've spent 12 years or more, 16 years, filling their heads with the classics of the ancient world about the indomitable spirit of humanity and the natural rights that we have towards self-determination and freedom from alienation, and they get a job in a plant, and they say, we would like to be a little bit more self-determining of our work. Let's vote for a worker cooperative. You see what I'm referencing here, the union vote last week in Tennessee, and then it's sabotaged. And we say, no, your role is not to play a part in the decision-making of this enterprise you're in. Your role is to work the machine and assemble the cog. And these are people who we've been exposing for so long to the value of thinking for yourself and taking a role in critical thought, and they're perpetually told, we don't need that, we don't want that. Honestly, I can imagine few more horrible things than an extraordinarily well-educated, empowered person who's constantly beat down by an economy that's hostile to that kind of thought. It sounds awful to me.
John, I agree with you, and I think not only that, but I think there's also the concern about large numbers of overeducated, I'm using that word advisedly,
right.
Overeducated, insightful, cognitively capable people who begin to recognize that the payoffs that society affords them are not nearly up to the quality of the education they received. In other words, what you've got is a large number of disenchanted, frustrated, very bright people, and that's a formula for disaster for a society, for social order. And so again, if you put it in the context of the individual person working in a rote kind of career with a machine or a computer or something like that, then you run the danger of individual frustration. But it seems to me if you end up with a large number of people educated like that, who in some manner or other are able to cooperate with each other, society's always been afraid of that also.
Oh, it's incredibly threatening. Yeah.
I agree with you, but I kind of think the burden of, maybe this is just optimism, unrealistic optimism on my part. But I kind of believe if you get a lot of well-educated people who are expecting those kinds of things, then one has to believe that society will find a way to deliver, to respond. I mean, I think that would enhance quality of life for everybody, because I think it would put demands on society which society at this point would not be able to fulfill. But my guess is at some point they might be able to. I don't know. But I do know that there's quite a bit of self-fulfillment in good education. In other words, there's an awful lot of payoff that you get irrespective of anybody else. I mean, just the ability to appreciate good literature or good music or theater or whatever is really valuable. I mean, it ties in with what John Adams told his son John Quincy about knowing how to live.
Yeah.
And a good education is a big part of that. And I don't think that that's a negative. The only way that becomes a negative is for people who believe that the purpose of an education is to get a meaningful job that is an accurate measure of their ability. And at this point, I agree with you, society would not be able to meet that kind of demand.
Right. So and that's an encouraging way of looking at it that you have, I think. And so I guess my issue is what can be done to encourage this sort of culture that it sounds like from the Friedman article that Google is encouraging. I mean, the description there, the reference to, we like to have people who have strong opinions about this is the way this should be done, but then when they are shown an alternative, they agree and they come around and they sort of select the natural leader, the way you said.
Yeah.
That sounds like an incredibly empowering environment to work for, but it requires a workforce that has been sort of trained and educated to to arise when necessary, like that, like you said. But it also requires a management structure and also a product to be created that's conducive to that sort of thing. And I think that, so my question is, I guess, how can we encourage it? Are there any lessons from the founders, for instance, on encouraging an economy or a system of trade or apprenticeship or something that values that sort of environment? Because that seems like a beneficial thing to push for. Well, we obviously need a new economy, but what shape it's going to take is kind of unclear, and that sounds like a very good shape to me.
Wow.
That's a lot. That's about 12 questions, I realize. Maybe but the point is they're all connected, they're all related, and they're all important. I mean, that,
Yeah. I'll tell you what's going through my mind right now is a couple of weeks ago we were talking about this book called The Second Machine Age.
Yes.
And what that book speaks to is not just the degree of change that's happening in the world of technology, but the speed of that change. And the fact that it's happening so fast, they're talking about some sort of a digital revolution every couple of years.
Yeah.
And so consequently, there's no way that the bulk of our people can keep up with that kind of technological advancement or improvement. And so, the concern that raised is that most of us will be rendered incapable of keeping up. In other words, there'll be a few brilliant people who'll be out there in front on top of these kinds of digital and technological changes, but the vast majority of us are going to be left in the dust.
Yeah.
And consequently, what society is going to have to do is find a way to make up for what's lost. In other words, what they point out, for example, is it may be necessary down the road to think about guaranteeing everybody a quality standard of living, whether in fact they work or not, because the reality is there's not going to be enough of what we now define as work to engage this many people, especially some of them being very well educated people.
Right.
And so we're going to have to find alternatives to meet the psychological needs of these people. And we know, right now, I mean, we talk a lot, and we will again, I'm sure, about the psychological benefits of work and what it means to people to be independent and self-sufficient and all of those things. And what happens to people that lose that sense of self-sufficiency, people in their 50s and 60s that lose their job and can't get another one, or what happens to them psychologically. They become drug addicts, alcoholics, whatever. And society's going to have to find a way to address those kinds of deficiencies. And maybe we're going to have to find an alternative to what we now call work as a way to do that. Maybe we're going to have to find ways to reward people for their creativity, whatever it might be. Their ability to contribute to the public good or to the general welfare, whatever contribution they might make in whatever area that becomes a product of their creativity, something that the general public wouldn't have access to without them, and finding a way to reward them for it. It raises some really fascinating challenges and questions. I'd love to be there. I'd love for us to be at the point where we're actually trying to do that. But, John, here in West Virginia, and you probably know this, especially in conversations with Bob on his program, but in West Virginia, there's been this long tradition here that, for the most part, many West Virginia parents have not wanted their kids educated for fear that they'll leave.
Right.
And the only way to keep them here is to keep them stupid, for lack of a better way to say it. And so they're what that has led to in West Virginia is this kind of anti-intellectualism that's not just prevalent among the uneducated, but in many cases it's prevalent among the educated as well, the business community as well. And they look at everybody as a potential labor force and a potential consumer market, and we're not seen as human beings or individuals with needs and psychological desires and aspirations and all these other things. And I think it works against us here in West Virginia. I'm thinking that kind of thing could become a national problem. But I don't know. It's fascinating. My God. Wow.
No, it is. And I appreciate I like hearing your train of thought work this out. I'm going to lose you in a minute in the cell, so I'm going to get out of the way. But thank you for your time, and I'm going to keep listening.
John, thank you, my friend. Thank you so much. Right. And please call again. I love interacting with you and sharing. Just listening to you is really enlightening. Thank you, John.
Thank you, sir. All right, good day. Okay,
I appreciate it. We are just at the bottom of the hour. We've got a little bit less than 30 minutes to go in our conversation. And we were talking about the conflict or the contradiction in the founders. And, of course, the one issue we've not addressed yet, and I was thinking about this during the break. In fact, this is the one issue that I have yet to address in working out some copy for this website. I've got to address it. It's the one thing I have left. And that is a reasonable explanation for what the founders are doing by being involved in this contradiction. In other words, I know that the founders are too bright not to know that what they were actively and actually presenting here was a dual system of education. At the risk of generating misunderstandings or any kind of negative feeling towards the issue of civil rights in America, all of us will remember in the post-Civil War South, from the late 19th century up well into the 20th century, the principle of Plessy versus Ferguson, the idea of separate but equal in Southern society. In other words, the Supreme Court gave its blessing to the Southern states to operate two separate systems of education, two separate transportation systems, two separate separate restaurant systems and all the rest of it in order to keep the races separate. And so the court's argument was it's okay to maintain a dual system as long as that it's based on equality. And we won't get into the absurdity of that, but for a long time that was the rule of the land. Well, the fact of the matter is, if you begin to look at what the founders have done with education in terms of the contradiction that we addressed in our first hour, it's pretty obvious that in one sense one could argue that the founders were operating almost a separate but equal systems of education based not so much on race but on class. In other words, based on where particular kids came from and where they were expected to go, what their career outlooks were, you were creating a kind of education to meet those very specific needs. Academics, to be positive about it traditionally, have called it student-based, education based on student needs, on individual needs, individualized instruction, where you basically assume that you know what the capability of the student is, and you restructure the information presented to that student in order to meet the particular educational and intellectual level that you anticipate or assume. And of course what that means is you don't stress or overstretch anybody. Education is tailored to meet the particular needs of the students involved. In reality, it's almost a separate but equal system. And in reality, that's what the founders were about. I mean, you know, if you take the same one, whether it's Washington and Hamilton or whether it's Jefferson and Benjamin Rush or whoever it is, they're saying all of these fantastic things about the colleges and universities they want to see in America. And at the same time, they're advocating a mode of education for citizens, which is based principally on rote and regimentation and regurgitation and recall and obedience and order and all of those things that we associate with a stable, secure society. And if those are your objectives, then it stands to reason that you would try to institute a system of education which would be conducive to those kind of outcomes. That's kind of a criticism of the founders. And I'm not all that inclined most of the time to criticize the founders. I can see the problems, many of them, but I also see the incredible creativity and awareness and sensitivity that that's revealed in what these people did and what they talked to each other about. So consequently, I think that I've come up with an explanation for the contradiction that the founders find themselves in, which makes them look pretty darn good, if that makes sense. I'm not excusing any of this other stuff, because to be very honest with you, I'm probably so passionate about what education can do and should do for people that anybody that plays around with it and does damage to it, I have problems with. But the fact of the matter is, education is an institution. Every education system in every nation, in every period, is a fairly accurate reflection of the priorities of the particular society that created it. What I'm suggesting is that institutions, by definition, reflect a sense of preparation, if you will, for entry into the mainstream of that particular organization or that particular society. Institutions, all of them, have in common the fact that they all seek order. They all seek stability. They all seek predictability. Those responsible for setting up any institution want to know that the education, that the institution they've created will help produce the outcomes that they want. Institutions are means to an end. There is what we're merging into here a little bit is a little bit out of my area, but it borders on sociology. What we're talking about here are the sociological aspects of institutions. And I'm struck, I'm remembering a book that I read many, many years ago, which is called Asylum, by Stanley Goffman, who's a sociologist. And Stanley Goffman studies institutions. And the title of his book is called Asylum. And obviously the institution of note here is an asylum, a mental health institution. Some of you are probably thinking back to Clockwork Orange here. Or One Flew Over, I'm wrong, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Big Nurse, remember that? Okay. The point I'm making here is that the very nature of an institution is to bring about predictable results. Consequently, the rules that govern the institution are rules drafted by the architects of the institution to produce a particular set of outcomes. And as a participant in that institution, as a patient in the asylum, for example, as an inmate in the prison, as a student in the school, as a spouse in the marriage, because all of these are institutions. They all are defined by expectations and a set of rules. Once we know the institution, we pretty much can anticipate the behavior of the people in that institution, because the whole idea of the institution is to bring about predictable results. You're rewarded for doing what's expected. You're penalized for doing something else. And so consequently, it doesn't take students long, for example. They don't have to be in school too many years, irrespective of whatever curriculum they have. But they don't have to be students for many years before they learn what being a student is all about. They quickly pick up clues and information in order to tell them what behaviors are rewarded and which behaviors are punished. Students quickly know that the name of the game is to get the right answer. Students learn very quickly that there's danger associated with giving a wrong answer. There's penalties associated with it. There are negatives associated with wrong answers. So the old idea about learning from your mistakes or from your failures has no place in our education system, and our students know it. You are rewarded for the number of answers you get right. You are penalized for the number you get wrong. It's that simple. Consequently, students quickly learn that if you wait long enough, somebody will tell you what the right answer is. The teacher will. The textbook will. The curriculum guide will. The State Department of Education will. The vocabulary at the end of the chapter will. Somebody will. The worst thing you can do is be wrong. So the way to avoid that is to not say anything until you're sure. And so we have this very unique approach to education in America, where a successful day in school is one in which nobody knows you were even there. You go to all your classes, you keep your mouth shut, you don't do anything wrong, you don't get into any trouble. The bell rings to start the class, you sit there, hopefully nobody will call on you. Finally, the class is over, the bell rings, and you leave. It's been a total success in that particular class. You were there for the beginning, you were there all the way through it, you were there at the end. You know everything that was covered, nobody called on you, you never gave a wrong answer, and so consequently you had a successful day. if you think about that, it's almost absurd, but it's real. Students know how to be students. They learn very quickly. They know how to take tests. They know how to deal with multiple choice tests by eliminating the options. They know how to reduce the number of choices to a 50-50 this or that, true or false situation. They become very adept at taking tests. They become very adept at looking for clues which indicate right answers or wrong answers. They learn how to do that very well. So don't tell me that they can't learn skills. They learn the skill of being a successful student very well. You sit there and you keep your mouth shut until you know what the right answer is, until somebody gives it to you, and then you make sure you give it back when it's asked for. And if you do that consistently enough, you'll get the reputation of being a bright student on the part of teachers. Teachers are human beings. They talk to each other. They meet over lunch. They meet in the lounges during coffee breaks. They obviously talk about students. Who you got this year? Oh, I had her last year. You got to watch her because she'll feign interest, but the reality is turn your back and she'll cheat. Once you get that kind of a label, you can't shake it. It becomes very, very difficult. So the student knows that you must avoid getting that kind of a reputation, that kind of a label. And so there's a certain character set that you want to fulfill. And so the irony is somebody always has the right answer. It's never you. It's the teacher or the textbook or the State Board of Education or the legislature or somebody, but never you. So the whole idea behind success in our education system is being able to reproduce right answers on command. And that's pretty much it. That's the education institution. But the same thing is true in an asylum or in a prison or in a marriage. Husbands are expected to act in certain ways and be responsible for certain things. They are expected to be the breadwinner. We have all sorts of stories about males, husbands who are raising the children while the wife works and all that stuff. But generally speaking, that's out of the ordinary. So everybody knows the role that they are expected to fulfill, and they do that. And that's what an institution does. One of the most successful institutions in the history of the West has been the Roman Catholic Church. And to look at its evolution, its development as an institution, what you begin to learn about is something about the sociological nature of institutions themselves. The church was created. St. Peter, was appointed by Christ as the first pope. Thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church. The purpose of the church was to make available the special graces that individual souls needed in order to get to heaven. God so loved mankind that he created the church, which would be the honest broker that would intercede for the individual sinner and show the sinner the way to get to heaven. In other words, as are all institutions, the church was created for a purpose, in order to ensure a distinct outcome. But lo and behold, as we look back on the development of the church, we begin to realize that the church, like all institutions, tends to become less the means to an end and more a means, an end in itself. Suddenly, power and defense of the church, in other words, suddenly the church's number one priority is not saving souls. It's preserving its influence and its power and its prestige from attack or from challenge, wherever that might come from. The rationale being that if anything happens to the church, then it can't deliver on the purpose for which it was created, which was to save souls. So suddenly, the church as an institution kind of gradually slides over into becoming an end in itself rather than a means to the end for which it was originally created. We saw that with the sexual abuse situation from priests. The extent, the extremes to which priests and popes and bishops and archbishops and cardinals would go in order to protect the church. And suddenly, we began to see that almost that the original purpose of the church was somehow perverted, and a means became an end. We see that in colleges. The purpose of colleges is to educate young people so that they can become successes in life. But suddenly, with the addition of size and endowments and foundations and prize-winning football teams, the preservation of the university or the college itself becomes more important than what it was created to produce. We saw this in the Penn State situation, where many of the officials of Penn State are now under indictment because they were willing to put the best interests and the security of Penn State University ahead of the welfare of individual children who were being abused. So there seems to be something in institutions which cause them to gradually evolve into ends in themselves rather than means, and to behave accordingly. I would suggest to you then that institutions by definition tend to reflect the priorities and the intent and the outcomes of their creators. Institutions are man-made entities that are created to accomplish specific outcomes or purposes or objectives, whatever you want to call it. And consequently, the very structure and the rules, the way it's organized, all of that is defined and determined by the intent of the creation of the institution in the first place. All right, where am I going with this? What am I saying? What I am saying in defense of the founders is if institutions are as we have just explained them and defined them, that the founders would champion a dual system of education, because the society in which they lived and the priorities of that society were rooted in the monarchical origins that came from Europe, came from the mother country. The idea that all societies, as Hamilton said, divide themselves into the few and the many. The few are the rich and well-born. The many are the rest of the people, Hamilton said in a speech to the Constitutional Convention. So if the society that the founders were most comfortable with was a class-based society and driven by the assumption that the few at the top would be the decision makers, they were the ones that needed the education, and the vast majority of people would end up on career paths that would not bring them into positions of decision-making and leadership authority. So consequently, the education they received had to be tailored towards preparing them for the role that they would play in the society that the founders assumed. If that's true, then that helps us understand and appreciate how the founders could simultaneously advocate for two different education systems tailored to the needs of two different groups of people and designed to produce two totally different sets of outcomes. The difference is, the key here is that the republic that the founders created and the principles on which it was based, Jefferson's statement of being endowed with certain inalienable rights to life, liberty, and property, and being brought into this world by our Creator on an equal footing with everybody else. What was in place, thanks to the founders, was a revolutionary kind of republican government that the world had never seen before. That was dedicated to producing a totally different kind of living for the vast majority of people. Its political system was participatory. Its economic system was capitalistic. Its modus operandi was individual freedom, individualism, the pursuit of individual success. It stands to reason that the educational system that would fit very nicely into that framework would be the dual system of education that the founders ended up advocating. I would argue that despite all the evidence and all the apparent contradictions, there really is not a contradiction over education for the founders. That the approaches to education that they advocated were quite consistent with the nature of the society in which they saw people living. But in our 21st century, we are looking at a totally different kind of society with a totally different kind of needs and objectives, and we've got to basically make the changes in the education system to meet those changes. And with that, it is 1 minute before the top of the hour, and Bob Kincaid, I know, is getting ready to fire up. So, Bob, go to it. Thank you all very much for listening today and participating. Thank you, John, for the call at the Virtual Center. Have a wonderful evening. Be safe. It's going to be very cold throughout most of the country this evening. Be safe, and we'll see you tomorrow here at the Virtual Center. Thank you.